What's up, guys? I'm Sci-Hi, and I want to share 5 tips for reaching Mythic Rank consistently in Magic Arena. These tips are mainly focused to newer players, but even expert players that have already reached Mythic may find some useful things here for getting to Mythic more consistently each season. So, without further ado, we'll jump into tip number 1. This tip may be a little bit sobering to hear for some people that like brewing creative, wild decks and experimenting with things, but we got to be honest with ourselves. And the first tip is to play an established deck in Constructed. Again, I know this can be a little bit sobering news if you love to brew and try different things. I also love to brew different decks, but we just got to keep it real here. When you're in an established format, it can be really difficult to find a brand new strategy that can hang with established decks. Brewing can certainly work in new formats, maybe after standard just had rotation. That's a good time to try a lot of new things and brew and experiment with different decks. But when you're in a well-established format, it's going to be a lot easier to pick a deck that you know can win and just try to stick to that and master it. Now that doesn't mean you have to completely destroy any creativity. You absolutely still can customize that deck, tweak different cards, and experiment with a few things here and there, but keep the general archetype intact. So maybe a new set comes out, and maybe you're playing Historic Constructed. That's a time to, for sure, go ahead, try a few different cards, but you're gonna just be better off with an established deck. Sometimes you think you have a really cool new idea, and you can just become absolutely delusional playing this, and it's just not going to be good enough to hang with other established decks. So it could be possible that the best player in the world just wouldn't even be able to get to Mythic with a certain strategy because it's just simply not good enough. So again, play an established deck. You can certainly tweak it a little bit to establish it your own and understand the card choices, but going with a well-established archetype is gonna be a better bet for getting to Mythic consistently. Tip number 2, we'll talk about adjusting in-game settings. Now, some of these gameplay settings can be a little bit marginal and deck dependent, but what we're talking about is the auto order triggered abilities and the auto assign combat damage. To be absolute, give yourself the best bet for winning games, you're going to want to remove these. Now, Magic Arena does a very good job of most of the time. It's going to order things in your favor, or auto assigning combat damage during combat isn't always going to matter, but there are fringe cases where this does matter. And understanding and knowing how the stack works is very beneficial as well, where you're going to have to order triggered abilities manually. And depending on different situations, you can actually get marginal benefits and even win games by having these off. But it is totally deck dependent. And again, this is a marginal thing. So it may be possible that you have a deck where this doesn't matter and this may just slow you down. So it's definitely something just to be aware of. Be aware of and experiment with, but you can get some benefits from adjusting and turning these things off. Definitely something to experiment with for sure. And then also, totally subjective for sure, but some people, myself included, can concentrate and focus a lot better with just eliminating the music and just having ambient sounds on and nothing else. Just finding it just kind of distracting. So this is something just to maybe tweak to your liking. Some people absolutely benefit from just listening to music or listening to music you enjoy, but myself, I happen to just turn the music off. So make sure you have your settings adjusted to how you want, and you're going to have better gameplay. But definitely be aware of those expert settings because they can make a difference in some decks. On to tip number 3. We're going to talk about mulligan strategy. You want to develop a complex mulliganing strategy for your deck. And this is absolutely deck dependent again, and also best of 1 versus best of 3 dependent. But you want to play a lot of games with your deck and understand like how many lands you need to operate. Some very low to the ground aggro decks can get by and function just fine on even 1 or 2 mana, but you have to know your deck and know when it's best to mulligan and throw away hands where you don't have enough land. Maybe you're running a control deck that needs a lot more lands to operate, and maybe you've worked out that you really absolutely have to have 3 lands in your opening hand, and you need to mulligan anything with less than 3 lands. Also, be aware when you're on the play or the draw, as that can change the odds of drawing a land, and you might want to be more aggressive and keep hands that you otherwise wouldn't on the play when you're on the draw. Also, in best of 3, when you're sideboarding, there might be a really critical card in the matchup that you bring in. You have a horrible matchup against a deck in game 1, but maybe game 2 you bring in some card that's extremely important. You might want to mulligan extremely aggressively, even down to like 5 cards, just to try to find that card to improve your matchup. So being aware of when you do and don't want to mulligan with your deck and the type of format you're playing in the matchup, very, very important. So definitely develop and work on establishing a complex mulliganing strategy. And again, we can make a whole video on that. It's very complicated and lots of different opinions and philosophies of how to mulligan, but it'll take time, and you just want to get comfortable with a deck and have a general strategy that you're relying on there. Tip number 4, we're going to talk about the phases of the game. It's important to learn the phases. Magic Arena, compared to Magic Online, kind of simplifies the phases a little bit, but generally speaking, when you're using instants or casting instants or using activated abilities at instant speed, you want to be aware and think about if it's the best possible time or phase to use such an ability. Now, again, we could do a whole video about just this alone on different types of effects and when it's best to use them. But I'll give you just a couple of very contrived examples to think about. For example, like with the card Collected Company, where it's an instant 4 mana, if you're not familiar. Most people are, of course, because it's a very popular card. But for 4 mana, we can look at the top 6 cards of our deck and choose 2 creatures and put them into play. There are times when casting this in the main phase may make absolute sense. Again, a contrived example, maybe you're running like an elf deck and you want to find a creature in your main phase before combat to maybe an elf lord to put into play and buff all your other elves before you attack. That's a contrived example where you'd want to play this during your main phase. On the other hand, there's examples where you absolutely would want to play Collected Company during your opponent's end step. Maybe you're against a control deck and they've got a lot of Wrath of God type effects where they can kill all your creatures. And if that's the case, casting Collected Company during their end step is going to dodge those sweeper type spells that would otherwise kill your creature. And then when your opponent passes the turn at their end step, now you have all these creatures that you just got into play from Collected Company and you can attack freely. But there are countless other examples. We could go on and on. One other easy contrived example, talking about different phases. We could talk about the card Culligan's Command, which has kind of a unique ability at instant speed where you can force your opponent to discard a card. There's not a lot of cards, and for good reason, that allow you to force your opponent to discard a card at instant speed. Because one thing you can do with that card is you can cast it during their draw step, and in that way, if your opponent draws any non-instant card and you cast a instant speed discard spell during their draw step, you can force them to discard that card immediately and they won't even get to use it. So understanding the phases is very important, especially for casting and using instant type effects, as well as just giving your opponent information. Generally speaking, you want to give your opponent as little information as possible. What I mean by that is, like, don't play things pre-combat unless you absolutely have good reason to do so. You can, bluff having a combat trick or another instant if you play things after combat versus pre-combat. So, like, an opponent might be playing around a certain spell, but if you just kind of play out your permanent creatures before combat for no reason and they weren't like aiding your combat step in any way, you just gave your opponent all the information, maybe you tapped out, and now they know you don't have anything to bluff or any combat trick. And even if you absolutely don't have any of those things in your hand, it's just good to pretend, at least fake your opponent out as if you do have those things. So learning phases and when to cast and use abilities is extremely difficult. It's something, even expert players are always still trying to figure out the best time to do things. And Magic is a complex game for sure, but being aware of the phases is very important. And always try to ask yourself when you're using an ability or casting a spell, is this the best time I should be doing this? Like, oftentimes it makes sense to do things during your opponent's end step rather than just like proactively right away if you're still going to have a chance to do so, just to give your opponent as little information as possible to react on in the current game state. So definitely focus on your phases and when to cast things. It's going to help you out a lot, but it's very difficult to master. Again, Magic's such a complex game. But also the fifth tip, and this may be sounding a little bit generic for sure, but practice, practice, practice. The more you play one deck, you're just going to become a master of that deck. And, getting to Mythic can be an absolute grind. As fun as it is to switch decks, it can be difficult to just keep switching decks and change your mind's context of what you're doing. You may forget what certain cards do. It's just so much easier if you just focus on one deck. And even if that may sound boring, you may get into so many different situations with just one deck. You would be amazed, even in just best of one, grinding all day. You'll start to see patterns and different things emerge in all the different matchups that you play. And the more experience, the more reps you get in with one deck, just means it's the more interesting and wild game states you're going to get into, and you're going to start to recognize these different situations because you've seen them before, because you've played this one deck so much, or you've played different matchups so many times that you're just going to have better knowledge of different matchups and how to play in weird situations where, like, for example, I've been in situations playing auras, and it's very usually just a straightforward, aggro deck plan. But when you're in the mirror match, sometimes the game can kind of slog out and get into a kind of a stalemate, and you can recognize a situation when you're both drawing so many cards that you can actually deck your opponent if you start to cool off and just try to play defense for a while. So there's just a wild range of weird situations and game states you can get in. And the more reps you get in with one deck, the better you're going to be. Like I said, if you keep switching decks, that's fine, but just be aware that you're just going to have to keep changing your mind's context of what you're doing, and you're going to be a little bit less familiar with the cards than you otherwise would be if you just played this one deck over and over again and just saw all these situations reoccurring over and over again. And again, it's amazing. Even if you could play a deck for 12 hours straight, and again, just in best of one, you'll be amazed that you still get into situations that you've never even seen before, just because Magic is such a complex game with so much variety. And finally, while this is not really a tip, be prepared for just bad luck streaks and going on tilt, and recognize when this happens. It may be a good time to take a break and chill out, because nobody likes losing 7-8 games in a row, but it absolutely can happen. There's still a good amount of luck involved with this game. We have to recognize that. Like, some decks depend on being on the play a lot more than others, and again, you're just rolling the dice every time you play. It's possible you can go 10 games, even more in a row, where you're on the draw, and that can just be difficult to win, and that's going to happen. But we need to keep it real. Don't let people tell you on social media or other bullshit places, whatever. Don't let people tell you that you have to grind 12 hours a day to get to Mythic. This is just absolutely not true. It could be true if you're depending on your win percentage, but as long as you're winning more than 50% of your games, you're going to grind out. You're going to get to Mythic. But it doesn't take an absurd amount of time. And oftentimes, rather than just grinding all day and getting tired, it can be better to just play in short periods of time, and just focus on winning matches and playing as best as you can. But again, like, don't let people tell you that it should take forever, because it really doesn't have to. But I don't know, guys. There you have it. Those are just a few tips to think about for trying to reach Mythic more consistently every season. Let me know what you think. If any of these tips help you. Some of them are more like philosophy, psychology based. Others are like gameplay based. But if any of this helps you, subscribe, like, share the video. Definitely let me know what you think. We'll do more Mythic gameplay and stuff and more strategy videos. So I appreciate you checking it out, and good luck on the ladder. Peace.